This moment is of great significance in the political history of our dear country, Nigeria. That Olusegun Obasanjo, retired of the PDP, having complied with requirements of the law and scored the majority of votes, is hereby declared the winner and is returned elected.
Nigeria's transition to civilian rule in 1999 was an unprecedented event, not just because he was the first civilian president in 15 years, but also because the winner of the election was a prisoner barely 9 months ago. So how did Obasanjo go from prisoner to Nigeria's president? While some would call it some sort of miracle, others will argue that it was in fact the work of Nigeria's political elite. To understand Obasanjo's rise to power, you have to go back to 1993, at the start of Abacha's regime. Anyone who listened to Abacha's takeover speech will have a sense of what was to come. Nigeria was about to get a leader that takes out anyone that stood in his way. He had just forced Shinikon's interim government to step aside and lay the foundation for his tyrannical rule. The atrocities committed under Abacha's administration needs no introduction, with countless journalists silenced, activists arrested, and political opponents imprisoned. One of such opponents was Olusegun Obasanjo, a former head of state and a man who would soon become a pain in Abacha's government. Like Abacha, Obasanjo was once a military head of state, but unlike Abacha, Obasanjo also adopted a pro-democratic stance. He was the first African military head of state to hand over to a civilian government and had since become outspoken about military intervention in government. Obasanjo was perhaps one of the few ex-military men who could do that. On one hand, he was a hero who helped win the Biafran War, but he was also a respected statesman. One could say Obasanjo was almost untouchable, but with Abacha, no one was untouchable. Abacha knew that many people opposed his government, and he countered that in his typical dictator-esque fashion, eliminating all that opposed him, from journalists to prominent politicians and even human rights activists. But one group that Abacha hadn't really taken care of was the military. There were still several high-ranking officers that resented him, and Abacha realized he had to eliminate them as soon as possible. To be fair to Abacha, the Nigerian political landscape had been one soiled by bloodied coup, and Abacha himself had partaken in some, so he knew his government could come crashing down with a single coup. In March of 1995, Abacha set off taking down his military opponents like clockwork. General Olusegun Obasanjo and his former second-in-command, General Shehu Musa Yar'Adua, along with several other high-ranking military officers, were arrested. They were accused of planning a coup centered around Brigadier General Lawan Gwadabi to overthrow Abacha, although there was no evidence tying them to any coup. Perhaps the only evidence tying Obasanjo to the alleged coup plot was a statement by another alleged coup plotter, Colonel Bello Fadile, obtained under duress. Colonel Fadile, General Yar'Adua, 40 other officers that had been critical to Abacha's government were arrested and detained, pending a trial. Obasanjo was initially moved around different detention centers without being interrogated before a plea by ex-US President Jimmy Carter forced Abacha to place him under house arrest. His next 2 months will be spent under strict surveillance by 14 policemen, with no access to visitors, a telephone, and even the media. 2 months later, Obasanjo was transferred to military custody. Life in military custody was anything but good for Obasanjo and other officers. They were tortured, beaten, and had to endure the most inhumane conditions. By June 1995, Obasanjo and other officers were brought before a special military tribunal. It brought a lot of uproar because people expected him to be tried before a civilian court, or at worst, a military court. Unlike civilian or military court, the special military tribune had no due process to be followed and could award any penalty in criminal or military law without any hope of an appeal. It was basically the best tool for any military head of state to eliminate his political enemies, and as expected, his sentence was cruel. Obasanjo was sentenced to life imprisonment, while his former number 2, Yar'Adua, was sentenced to death. The sentence brought huge backlash from Nigerians and the international community. Nobody for once believed Obasanjo was a part of any coup attempt. In fact, it was almost a widely known fact that Abacha was simply eliminating a man that had dared to stand up against him. With mounting pressure from the international community, especially US President Bill Clinton, who promised to place an embargo on Nigerian oil, their sentences were commuted. Obasanjo's life imprisonment was reduced to a 30 years prison sentence, then to a 15-year sentence. For what it's worth, that did little to ease his plight. And Obasanjo's next few years in prison were hellish. He spent his next 3 years in 4 Nigerian prisons. During his first stop at Kirikiri Maximum Security Prison, he frequented the prison hospital and was almost always in critical condition. From the first few months at the prison, it was clear that Obasanjo was in no state to be in such a prison. He suffered from diabetes and hypertension, and he wasn't helped by the fact that he had limited access to medical attention. After a few months at Kirikiri, Obasanjo was transferred to Jos Prison along with many others. The only indication of his former status was that he wasn't in chain like the other prisoners. Apart from that, Obasanjo got the same treatment, and conditions in Jos were a lot worse than in Kirikiri. However, it was here that Obasanjo's health began to improve. He received help from many people in the military, notably Danjuma, who gave him some money, and Chief of Staff General Abdusalami Abubakar, who helped Obasanjo secure a private room away from the cramped spaces of Jos Prison. A better prison environment saw Obasanjo gradually develop a love for reading, become a fervent Christian, and detail his experience in books. On the other hand, pressure continued to mount on Abacha's government for Obasanjo's release. The German, Indian, and South African government called for his release, but to no end as Obasanjo continued to languish in prison. Seeing as he was going to spend a number of years in prison, members of his extended family fought for the control of his business. His house got robbed, and his wife was injured in an attack. There's no way to know if any of these two events were connected or not, but it seemed that everyone wanted a piece of Obasanjo's wealth now that he was in prison. By 1996, Obasanjo was moved to a more remote prison in Yola under similar conditions. At Yola, attempts were made to poison him, but those attempts failed. Now, despite a relative relaxed atmosphere at Yola prison, the effects of his long prison stay were already starting to tell on him. Obasanjo, a once vibrant man, now looked as if he had been malnourished for years. Perhaps the only way he managed to keep his hope alive was through the Bible he read constantly. Obasanjo found God in a very special way while in prison. He developed a dedication to God that was quite unexpected for a man like him, and would even preach the gospel to other inmates. It was during this period that Obasanjo received news of Yar'Adua's death. Apparently, Yar'Adua had collapsed and died of liver failure on his way to the hospital. However, some believed that there was more to his death than just a medical condition. There were rumors that Yar'Adua had been poisoned and Obasanjo was probably next. But before anything could be done to eliminate Obasanjo, Abacha died suddenly.
The key oil-producing country of Nigeria is in a state of flux. Its military leader, General Sani Abacha, has died of a heart attack. Abacha was 54. Top officials of the West African country convened an emergency meeting to sort out the question of succession. Who will run this country?
A heart attack, poisoning, or assassination. No one really cared how Abacha died. His death on the 8th of June 1998 was an event as monumental as when Nigeria first gained independence. It was in fact an independence of some sort from an oppressive, brutalist and tyrannical government. Nigeria could finally take a breath of fresh air and hope for better days ahead. In the days following Abacha's death, top Nigerian military commanders installed the apolitical Lieutenant General Abdusalami Abubakar to usher in a return to civilian rule. General Abubakar's first act of office focused on freeing all political prisoners, including Obasanjo and many other top political figures and members of the press imprisoned by Abacha. One top political figure that was set to benefit from this was Chief MKO Abiola. However, on the day he was scheduled for release, he died mysteriously. It seemed that even with Abacha gone, most of the political elites didn't want Abiola out of prison. And it made sense. Abiola was likely to prosecute many military officers for offenses committed under Abacha, and he still stood a very realistic chance of becoming president. Obasanjo, on the other hand, would be more sympathetic to the military officers. For all intents and purposes, Abiola's death seemed too convenient to go down without any form of suspicion. His death would fuel several riots all over the southwest.
Are victims of today. Survivors of today. They become victims of tomorrow. Yes.
In the meantime, the military could now prepare for a smooth transition to civilian rule.
Congratulations, sir. How do you feel today, sir?
I feel fine. I feel fine, sir. I've always felt. I feel fine. It's nice to be back at home. Anybody knows that. So I feel fine.
Obasanjo was released from prison barely 1 week after General Abdulsalami Abubakar took over. His homecoming was a huge affair all over Nigeria, from his hometown to the remotest part of southwest Nigeria. A Thanksgiving service was even held to celebrate Obasanjo's return from prison, which coincided with his newfound Christian faith.
Excellent wisdom and knowledge.
After his release, Obasanjo visited South Africa, Britain, and the United States for medical treatment. However, it seemed Obasanjo's medical trips weren't just for his health. He was forming useful alliances before he could launch his presidential dream. While Obasanjo was in America, movements began to take place by the Nigerian political elite. Each one of them seemed to be searching for the answer of the question, who would lead Nigeria? Obasanjo's name was thrown into the mix by his former associate, General Aliyu Gusau. Once Gusau and other top ex-military men, including Babangida, were comfortable with the choice of Obasanjo, the next step was to find a suitable political party for him to run. The late General Yaradua's party, the People's Democratic Movement, now controlled by Atiku Abubakar, were keen to adopt Obasanjo as their candidate. The fact that he was Yaradua's former superior and his Nigerian nationalist views, which meant he would pose minimal threat to the northern elite, made many top officials support him. In the primaries, Obasanjo was up against a tough opponent, Alex Ekweme, Shagari's former vice president and a man that was instrumental in reorganizing the PDM into the widely recognized PDP. In the run-up of the presidential election, the PDP had become quite a powerful party. In fact, they held more influence than other parties in Nigeria. They swept through local government and state elections cleanly and had become the party to belong to if you wanted to win an election. Their umbrella, which signified PDP's embrace to different individuals across the entire political spectrum, was flying high in many parts of Nigeria. When the time came for the PDP to choose its candidate, a convention was held in Jos, in which Obasanjo won with 60% of the votes to Ekweme's 20%. Obasanjo now faced former Finance Minister Chief Olufalaye in the elections. Falaye was running an unholy alliance of the All People's Party, the APP, and the Alliance for Democracy, AD. The APP largely consisted of northern elites close to the Abacha regime and had come in second place in the state and local government elections. The APP had notoriously become known as the Abacha People's Party. Seen as the party consisted mainly of the northerners, it had a northern-forced bias. The only reason the party decided to go for a candidate from the south was because the general consensus around Nigeria was that the president should be from the south. Nigeria had seen a host of northern military leaders in the years prior to 1999. The AD, on the other hand, was a party of Yoruba elders who controlled the Afenifere Ethnic Association, a Yoruba nationalist organization. The party had been established by Bola Ige, who incidentally was involved in the formation of the PDP and AD, but had left for various reasons. The AD would go on to select Chief Olufalaye over Bola Ige as their presidential candidate. The APP would decide to go with Falaye as part of the alliance. So in essence, the election was between PDP's Obasanjo and the APP AD's Olufalaye. Once Obasanjo secured the PDP's nomination with Atiku Abubakar as his running mate, the PDP went on an extensive campaign attempting to sell Obasanjo as Nigeria's best option. And it seemed to work, not because he was in fact Nigeria's best option, but for a number of reasons. One was that Obasanjo was a southerner with a more broad view of politics, a Nigerian nationalist to the core, so he posed little threat to the north, who were always weary of the southern leaders. It meant he was the perfect southerner to put into government that wouldn't necessarily threaten northern interest. Being a former military leader, Obasanjo was probably going to go soft on most military officers for crimes committed during military rule. Most notably, Babangida saw this as useful. Obasanjo was probably going to focus more on development rather than prosecuting any military leader. It definitely explained why Babangida and Danjuma were huge financiers of Obasanjo's campaign. Now, of course, the APP-AD alliance saw what was going on, but they had ideas of their own. They knew they would win most southwestern votes because Obasanjo was quite unpopular among the Yorubas due to his refusal to recognize Abiola as the winner of the June 12 elections, which was mostly true. While Obasanjo stood against Abiola's imprisonment and Abacha's tyrannical government, he never explicitly accepted Abiola as the winner of the 1992 elections. They also hoped that if they went for a northern vice presidential candidate, just like the PDP, they could split the northern votes and finally hope to sweep through the southeast and south-south because of Obasanjo's role in winning the Biafra War. Obasanjo had led the last offensive push by the Nigerian army into the last Biafra stronghold and ended all hopes of a nation called Biafra. The APP and AD couldn't have been more wrong.
This moment is of great significance in the political history of our dear country, Nigeria. That Olusegun Obasanjo, retired of the PDP, having complied with requirements of the law and scored the majority of votes, is hereby declared the winner and is returned elected.
In fact, they were wrong on all but one assumption, that they would win the southwestern vote. Obasanjo won election by a massive 62.8% of the APP-AD's 36.22%. Although the election saw a turnout of about just a quarter of Nigeria's population and was marred by widespread rigging, the results were generally accepted.
Well, I'm afraid there's been no election. What has happened is a farce because the will of the people has been subverted by large-scale and massive rigging of the vote throughout the country. I hope that there will be no violence. We don't believe in violence, but we believe in justice. So I will say to all our supporters, who are the majority of Nigerians, to remain calm and await further developments and further instructions from us.
Whether the results were subverted or not, Nigeria now had a civilian president, and many Nigerians were more concerned with ushering in a new civilian era rather than focusing on the past. Chief Olufalaye went on to challenge Obasanjo's victory in court and lost at the tribunal. Rigging or not, Olufalaye had lost to a better equipped Obasanjo. However, they had a few things to blame. One was INEC's refusal to remove the APP from the ballot, since the APP and AD had adopted the same candidate. INEC claimed that it had already printed the ballot paper, and this led to so many voided votes. Although the election have seemed like a reflection of the will of the people, we could almost say that it was the will of a small group of powerful politicians who saw Obasanjo as a useful tool.
The people of Nigeria have made their choice. I am humbled by the fact that I, Olusegun Obasanjo, am that choice.
Obasanjo's acceptance speech gave Nigerians a hope of a new Nigeria. But while Nigerians assumed they were getting a new Nigeria, in reality, it was the same old country, the same old politicians, and as people realized later on, the same old enemy who had stagnated Nigeria's growth for years: corruption.
Take the Holy Bible in your right hand and repeat after me. I, Olusegun Obasanjo,
I, Olusegun Obasanjo,
do solemnly swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and that I will preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. So help me God.
Nonetheless, Obasanjo was sworn in as Nigeria's president on the 27th of May 1999, and he would go on to serve 2 terms. Obasanjo ushered in the Fourth Republic in style, with developmental projects and a focus on improving living conditions, fostering national unity and defeating corruption.